Hello, class. At this point, we will be discussing biodiversity and evolution. We talked about the importance of biodiversity as one of the pillars of environmental sustainability. It is now that we will actually talk about biodiversity types, and the theory of how biodiversity continues. So, one of the earlier concepts that we discussed was integration, right? This idea that at these varying scales of biological organization, that we can actually cascade through them and integrate those different units into groups and functioning units at higher levels, right? So as we move through this actual diagram, we see that genes and um, bioparticles and biomolecules organize themselves into units that we eventually notice and experience as species. These species then are interact with abiotic factors um, and each other at the ecosystem level. Okay, um, and we see this happening in different places, different spaces, which then interacting with such things as climate create they will create a varying amounts of ecosystems with varying species types. When we talk about biodiversity, we've normally talked about it in the sense that biodiversity itself is this imagining of different species, but it's actually more than that. It's the varying of the genes, the variance in the ecosystems, and the functions within the ecosystem. Very important to this course, very important to this unit, is the idea of the different types of biodiversity. It is how we can actually go in and quantify biodiversity. We quantify biodiversity in different ecosystems based upon these 7 different areas. And if you ever hear a scholar talking about biodiversity, one of the first questions you should ask yourself, if not the scholar, is what type of biodiversity are you referring to? Is it simple species diversity, or are you talking about the actual biodiversity within the structure of the ecosystem? Or are we talking about the temporal changes in diversity? Right? These are all very important to functioning of an ecosystem, and you should consider them all. So the first type that we have is species. It's simply the number of species within a given or defined system, right? The number of species that we find in the forest ecosystem, the number of species in the soil ecosystem or an aquatic ecosystem, right? We can go in and we can identify these different species based upon the species considerations that were made by past scientists. Okay, um, fairly new to this to the area of biodiversity is genetic biodiversity, and it's the variability in genetic information in the system, right? And what does that mean? I mean, how is that different than species diversity? Well, every organism, even within a species, within a subspecies, has variation in their genome. And if we can identify that space, that chromosome, uh, that gene in which they vary, we can then show that there's variation in, say, a field of specific line of sweet potatoes or a specific line of corn, or say if we have an entire plantation of loblolly pine, we can go in and we can test each tree and show that there's genetic variation between them all. So that's looking at genetic biodiversity. Although something may seem or look to be a single species, there is an underlying variation or underlying biodiversity amongst that group. Okay, now we then move to the physical types of biodiversity. These are very easy. You know, your vertical and your horizontal uh, biodiversity. Vertical, one of the easiest examples of this is in a forest ecosystem, right? If you look at vertical diversity, we could start at the ground, right? And we'll look at the litter layer, right? What type of invertebrates, um, what type of fungus are existent in this layer. So then we take the amount of species there, the amount of groups there, and then we'll then look at the understory or the brush, the low-lying plants in that forested ecosystem. How many different groups are there? Then we'll move up, um, uh, and then we'll look at tree-dwelling species, right? Birds, lichens, other organisms that dwell in the mid-range of trees. And then we can move higher into the trees where there's other bird species, and then we actually can talk about the species of the trees themselves. We then can go in the reverse order from the ground layer and look at the soil diversity, right? So we've actually then stratified one, two, three, four, five vertical layers, and we can compare them. We can do a comparison of the biodiversity within each. Or we can look at the number of layers of diversity in the forest ecosystem and then compare it to the number of layers, say, in an agricultural ecosystem. Okay? And then horizontal is in the opposite direction. We're looking at something that's spatially distributed uh, in a horizontal way. Um, so we can, the best example of this would be to do a species diversity map, right? You're then using your directions of north, south, east, and west to determine the amount of biodiversity within the ecosystem or the pockets of biodiversity in the ecosystem. Okay. Um, the next concept, the next concept of biodiversity is something that we may have to define a particular aspect of ecology before we delve into it. Um, so it says structural diversity. And structural diversity is the number of niches in an ecosystem. Um, so when we look at this idea of niche, niche is, or it describes how an organism responds to the resources in its ecosystem. So when we think about niche, it's a concept that's related not only to uh, biodiversity. So the niche is a very interesting concept because it is the result or the coming together of the physiological, behavioral, and morphological adaptation of a species to its ecosystem or to the resources in the ecosystem. So it's different from species in the way that niche includes this idea of function. It's the coming together of the biotic and abiotic environment. The best way to describe niche would be the role uh, within an ecosystem. And as you can imagine, this is different than function, right? So if, for instance, the role that we're describing, the niche that we're describing are um, uh, ammonia oxidizers, right? We talked earlier about AOBs, ammonia oxidizing bacteria. That's a group of bacteria. Um, there's many species within that group, right? But they all play that role. Once again, diazotrophs, the bacteria that break that azide bond in atmospheric nitrogen, that is a group of bacteria. It's not just one species, right? It's a group. So they play a role. That's a niche within that actual ecosystem, right? So then we're not actually counting species with when we're talking about structural diversity. We're counting the role. So within the ecosystem, um, let's stay with the forest ecosystem. We may need and let's be more specific. Let's do the soil of a forest ecosystem. We need ammonia oxidizers. We need nitrite oxidizers. We need diazotrophs. We need carbon oxidizers, right? Then, for instance, let's then move to a different type of soil, wetland soil, um, where we necessarily will not need that um, because of the different functions that are going on in that ecosystem. Okay, so it's the different roles, number of roles within the ecosystem. So I want you to understand this idea of niche as right this evolved role in an ecosystem, and structural diversity is looking at the different number of roles within the ecosystem. Now, functional diversity, similar but not the same. It's the number of species which serve different roles. Okay, so if in terms of structural, looking at the roles alone, functional, we're then looking at the number of species which serve different roles. Okay, so structural, number of roles; functional, number of species that serve different roles. Right? How are the species of an ecosystem spread amongst the roles of the ecosystem? And then temporal. Temporal will be basically seasonal changes in the amount of species or groups within an ecosystem. Right? Now the changes can be due to migration, uh, can be due to stasis, um, can be due to certain organisms dying off at a certain time of year. Right? So those contributions will change ecosystems' temporal biodiversity. Every ecosystem has temporal biodiversity because of the abiotic changes that come through changes in the season. And also remember that all of these put together are going to equal ecological diversity. So if I ask you to define and uh, uh, specifically explain the components of ecological diversity, you should be able to uh, bring forth all seven of these types of biodiversity. Okay. Evolution. Biological evolution is simply the theory that explains the process by which Earth's life changes over time through changes in the biological infrastructure of organisms. Right. This is not implementing uh, scientific cosmology. We're not explaining the how the Earth came to be or how we came to be out of evolution. We're talking about the changes that we see in ecosystems over time. Um, Evolution is real. It's been recognized as being real by some of the most conservative states and peoples in the U.S. What we still argue about is uh, science's theorizing about the beginnings of life, uh, which is supported and not supported through the very spacious evidence that's used. But what we're talking about is the changes that we see uh, due to seasonal changes, due to the climate changes in the organisms that we experience and monitor and have studied, over the past few hundred years. That evolution is very real, um, and can be quantified in changes in um, uh, genetic diversity, species diversity, temporal diversity, structural, functional, horizontal, and vertical diversity. Right? We've used those tools, those 7 tools, to actually quantify evolution at this level. Okay, so when we speak about evolution, we're looking at changes within the biosphere and the ecosystems that we study. Now, when we speak about evolution, we talk about these 2 types, um, and you've seen evidence for both. There was a time when it was either or, at least when I was studying biology as a young student. But there's evidence to support both of these. So depending on the species and the abiotic pressure from the species, you'll see these different methods of evolving. So the first is the gradualism, phyletic gradualism, which is on the left. Um, and these are communities that will change fairly easily to changes in the immediate environment. As temperature rises, they'll gradually develop a certain uh, adaptation for that temperature rise. Um, as drought happens, um, actually, let's hold off on drought. Temperature is a good one. Um, as a species, uh, as their resources start to dwindle, um, they may adapt a new feature to exploit another resource. Um, but that's gradual as that resource declines. Now, this other idea is punctuated equilibrium. Punctuated equilibrium is more about uh, communities making quick changes, quick turns in their evolutionary cycle to adapt to certain changes in the environment. So, for instance, drought can be one of these, right? If we notice that on the y-axis we have time, and on the x-axis we have morphology. So, if we're going straight up here, and then at this juncture there was a huge drought, what it's saying is there was a large change in species morphology in a very short amount of time, right? So in this very short amount of time, you have the rise of another species, right? And it was all prompted by an event at this juncture in time, right? So a volcano eruption, a, uh, a serious drought, some catastrophic natural event. And in some cases, it doesn't have to be a natural event. It could be, for instance, if we're talking about bacteria, soil bacteria, this can be a spill of a toxin, right? There has to be a quick evolution of species and giving rise to a new, right? And then you see these events happening constantly, right? So a large catastrophic event leading to a swift change in morphology. Gradualism, as defined, is a model of evolution which theorizes that speciation is slow, uniform, and gradual. When evolution occurs, it is usually by steady transformation of the entire species into a new one. In this view, no clear line of demarcation exists between an ancestor and a descendant unless splitting occurs. Now, punctuated equilibrium is proposes that sexually reproduced species will experience little change for most of their history and remain in stasis for an extended amount of time. It then says that large events and rare events cause large net change and branching, cladogenesis. Cladogenesis is a very important term, um, but it's basically speciation, right? Natural selection is another concept that I want you all to know. Once again, non-natural selection is applied to man as Darwin forwarded in his Origin of Species, um, or the Descent of Man. I want you to know natural selection insofar that it is the pressure um, that is put on species by its immediate environment. And it states that because of that variation that we talked about, that genetic variation, right? So we had all of those uh, trees in the pine stand that were the same species, but they had genetic variation. They were attacked by a naturally occurring disease, and we had a 20% survival rate, right? That's natural selection. And then those that survived, they had the genetic makeup that would lead to the rise of a new resistant population. That is the operation of natural selection. So the limitations on this is that changes in environmental conditions can lead to adaptation or genetic traits that are already present in the gene pool or those resulting from mutation. So these selection events could replicate, what has been done by gradual or random events. Right? So natural selection itself um, may be redundant. Reproductive capacity limits the ability to adapt. Many organisms have temporal constraints, and this is simply stating that um, if the organism doesn't have a high capacity to reproduce or to pass on that survival trait, natural selection doesn't work. Right? One of the biggest misconceptions is that survival of the fittest equals survival of the strongest. Only the strong survive. Huge misconception. That's the pop culture terminology. Uh, if I see it on your exam, it's going to be marked wrong. Only the strong survive is not a biological concept. Strong is not a biological concept. Fitness has to do with the environment, has to do with timing, right? What is fit today may not be fit for the environment tomorrow. The organism that survives today may not be the organism that survives tomorrow, right? We also have to separate natural from unnatural selection, right? For instance, when we talk about agriculture itself, right, it's the result of uh, human selection, unnatural, artificial selection. So those, so we usually choose for the biggest, strongest, plushest, sweetest, juiciest types. It's not about uh, fitness. It's about what seems strong or what the palate likes. Um, these things were by nature before they were artificially selected. Right? So now the pressures that are put on them are both not just uh, natural selection when they're in the field growing, it's human selection. And that's why agriculture goes above and beyond to push back the pressures of nature when we're growing in the field, right? You try to limit the amount of water. You want to control the amount of water the plant gets. You want to control the nutrients that the plant gets because you've actually made the plant weak by selecting for a specific trait. So you have to beat back natural selection in order for it to survive. Um, Organisms develop traits out of necessity. That's not true either, right? The traits are developed by randomness, right? Selection events are random as well, right? A natural disaster can be random, right? The last thing is that evolution tends toward perfection. Evolution never ends. Evolution is simply change, right? There's no perfect being, uh, or for whatever species you're referring to. It's a constant change. That's all, and we'll continue um, with environmental justice. Thank you.